Lepo pozdravljeni na prvem predavanju Znanost na cesti v Knjigarni Konzorcij. And of course, a warm welcome to our guest, Alok Jha.
Hello.
And welcome to Slovenia, Alok.
Thank you.
I will briefly introduce you. You studied physics and science communication. As a journalist, you have worked for all British media that covers science seriously and with quality. That is The Guardian, ITV News, BBC Radio, and of course the TV of all TVs, BBC, where you were, for example, part of a science show, Dara O'Brien Science Club. This is my favorite show for years, and I believe it will remain on the first place. And now you write for The Economist. And the way I see you, you feel at home in all fields of science journalism and in all different media, such as newspaper, radio, TV, journals. What is actually your favorite media?
That description sounds like a really good guy. I want to be that guy. I'm not sure that I planned any of this, to be honest. I do feel comfortable in all those media, but I tell you what, interesting thing is that it's almost accidental to get into all these different things. And the reason I did go into all these different things...
It's hard to believe, but okay.
Well, it's because I have such a short attention span. I get bored really quickly in doing just one thing. So I'd have to try and find something else to do. And opportunities sort of come your way. You try and go for them. What do I like the most? I like writing the most, I would say. Writing is my most favorite thing. But it's also the most difficult for me because it's incredibly... lonely, and also you have to really, really focus for a long time. And I've just told you I don't have very good focus, but I like the products of writing because you can really get into the detail of things. But in terms of fun, definitely television. It's the best for fun, but you don't really do any detail. That's the problem. So between the two, somewhere, if there's something, that would be interesting.
You said you want to be that guy I've just described.
Yeah.
But I want to be that guy too.
We all want to be that guy,
yeah.
whoever that guy is.
Because I wanted to say in one way, you are my role model. But on the other hand, you annoy me.
All right.
Because whenever we have been talking about our stories, what I want to report about, you already done it.
I think people can do stories more than once. Let's just get that out of the way.
Yes. And you know, once we were talking about fusion power plant construction site in France.
ITER.
Yeah. I used ground footage to show it in our program for TV Slovenia. While you flew over it with a helicopter explaining what can be seen on the ground.
Yeah,
I was so jealous.
Yeah, but this is before drones were really a thing. But we flew in a helicopter, that's right. I couldn't believe we got the permission to do that, to be honest. The French military had to give us permission to fly over this very sensitive nuclear site, yeah. It was fun. Like I said, TV is so much fun.
Yeah. And obviously, you have money. That's the
Not
other
personally.
thing. Okay, and on the top of all this, you wrote 3 books. We can see them here. And today we will talk about the most recent one, which is about the water. So of course, the first question is, why did you write a book about water?
It's a good question, and people ask me this, and I should really have a much better answer than I do. But in all honesty, the reason I decided to write this book about water, which actually I was a few years ago now, and I've sort of had a long time to think about some of the themes within it. But the reason I got into it in the first place was because I collect weird facts about things. So things like water is one of these molecules that freezes at 0. Well, it's the only molecule that freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and boils at 100. And I thought that's quite neat. That's a bit strange. It's the only thing that's pH 7. It's like neutral between acid and alkali. And I thought this is weird that there's nothing else that's neutral like that. And I collected all these informations, and what you realize is that water is much, much more strange, much more abnormal than we give it credit for. We kind of interact with it every day by drinking it, eating it, cooking with it. Your clothes are made with water. But even though we interact with it more than we interact with anything else, any molecule, any person, any object, you probably never ever think about it. And so my purpose in the book was to just make people think about it a bit. And also not only to think about it, but to make them realize just how strange and weird it was. And if it wasn't strange and weird, then none of us would be here today, because it explains life, it explains all sorts of other things about the planet, which we take completely for granted. And it's the way into all of those stories. So that's why I got interested.
Okay. And did you get the idea because of your trip to Antarctica?
Well, so the trip I went to Antarctica was part of an expedition. It was a scientific expedition, and I wanted to go to cover it for The Guardian. I was working at The Guardian at the time, and my main reason for going was because I covered climate change quite a lot at The Guardian, and environment, and I would always report on the results of science research in the paper. So once something was published in a journal, I'd report on it. And obviously, if you're a scientist, you know that anything published in a journal or talked about in a conference represents years of work from maybe hundreds or thousands of people, years and years, maybe decades even. And it's all condensed into this one result. And so I would report those results in newspaper or on TV or whatever. But I wanted to go behind it and think and show what it took to get to those results. So with climate change, which was a huge topic then as it is now, we had all these data about the temperature of the surface of the oceans or the movement of sea ice, and we'd make models of the Earth and look at how temperatures were changing and so on. But to actually get the data to feed those models required individual scientists to go across the oceans and put thermometers into the oceans and measure temperatures and bring bits of seawater up and analyze them on ships. They had to go on these epic voyages, and it's hard work. And I wanted to show the world what it took to get this information about the world. You know, we just take for granted that the Earth is warming by this temperature or the temperature of the oceans are this, but actually it's really hard to do that work. So my point was to go along with these scientists to do that. And in the process of doing that, I realized that it was also a very useful way to look at water, which is why it features in my book as well. It was never intended to be part of the book, actually. They were separate things. But then when you go to Antarctica, so I went on a ship, which took 10 days to get to Antarctica, and it's the roughest sea in the world, so you get sick, and it's horrendous. I mean, no one told me it was going to be that bad before I went. So I should have investigated this a little bit more before I went. Anyway, you go for 10 days across the ocean, you get to Antarctica, and you see water in all its forms. The ice on the land, ice in the sea, the water in the oceans, of course, clouds, and then, of course, the weather is epic. You know, there's rain for days and days, sometimes it snows. And you see that your entire environment is water in 3 dimensions and in multiple forms. And you think, you know, you live in cities and things and you see maybe 1 or 2 forms of water every day, but there everything is water, everything is water. And so it became very visceral, and so it became a very important part of the book.
Okay, but maybe you can tell us more about the expedition.
Yeah.
What were scientists trying to do there, to measure there? How did you actually feel there? Because I've seen some of the pictures which shows that very well.
Well, I mean, since we have the picture of this guy up, this is actually me on the trip. No, it's not. This is Douglas Mawson, and he's an Antarctic explorer, and he is... Does anyone know who Douglas Mawson is? No? He's not well known compared to the other great Antarctic explorers. Scott, Amundsen, and Shackleton, I suppose, are the ones that everyone knows as the people who discovered Antarctica. But Douglas Mawson, who's a contemporary of theirs, and actually he was on one of Shackleton's earliest voyages, he stands equal with those 3 in terms of discovering Antarctica. And in 1913, he mounted an expedition, funded privately, to go to Antarctica. And unlike the others, he was doing science, or much more science than the others were. So Amundsen and Scott were racing to get to the South Pole. Shackleton didn't quite make it to the continent. He wanted to do science. He was a geologist. And so he wanted to get to the pole as well, but he wanted to understand the magnetic fields. He wanted to understand the wildlife on the way, the sea ice movements, etc. So for me, he was an amazing character because, you know, he as someone who is a follower of science, he was the first scientist really to get to Antarctica. And so this was him. with his sort of nice woolly hat on to go to Antarctica, and this was my version of the same thing. Obviously, he had much less advanced technical fabrics than I did. I spent quite a lot of the Guardian's money on technical fabrics that look better, look nice, because I don't like going outside, mainly central London, if I'm honest. I'm a very sort of, I don't really like the cold, I don't like bad weather, any of these things whatsoever. So it was a really unnatural environment for me. And so the plan was to follow in the footsteps of Douglas Mawson. He'd been on his 3-month expedition in Antarctica. I mean, his stories are incredible. I recommend you read them. His book, Home of the Blizzard, is it's like a novel when you read it, about the kind of the work he did there. And I'll skip over some of the stories, but he was very, 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 he had a very bad time, basically. He lost lots of his comrades. He had to eat dogs to survive in one of his expeditions. People, it was not a pleasant experience. So we were going to recreate some of that, and hopefully without the unpleasantness, by retracing his steps, his expedition across the Southern Ocean, and then going to the same place in Antarctica that he had. And this was the ship we went on. It was a Russian ship, a Russian polar vessel. And if you look at the horizon in that ship, in that picture, this is an actual picture one of my colleagues took on the ship. You can see that it's not very horizontal. That horizon, and genuinely, it's from New Zealand where we left to go to Antarctica, 10 days, East Antarctica. It's the roughest sea in the world, because there's no land after about 50 or 60 degrees south. There's no land all the way around, so the winds just go round and round the earth, and they whip up the oceans, and so you get these enormous waves, and the ship was sort of tilting about 20 degrees each side like this for several days.
How sick were you?
I mean, I was horrible. I was sick within 1.5 hours of being on the ship. And I remember thinking the expedition was meant to last a month. It was going to last a month. We're going to 10 days there, then go around Antarctica and come back. 10 days. 1 hour into this expedition, this is horrible. I can't be on the ship anymore. I must get off. But you couldn't. You can't just walk off that. You can't walk off. There's no way off for 1 month after that. It was appalling. So for the first day or maybe 2 days, I was sort of in bed. And all I could feel was the ship going like this constantly. And every so often, I just like putting my hand out to stop myself hitting the wall. And then you just get into this rhythm of doing this, hitting the wall business. And then there were some people who couldn't get out of their bunks for a week. I mean, seasickness is a funny thing. I don't know if you are sailors, any of you, but some people who get it and some people don't, and it's impossible to predict who gets it. So you just have to get over it. And some people on this ship had been to Antarctica 100 times, and even they got it. So every time they would get it. And some people had never been before, and they were fine. The good thing was the food on the ship was incredible. I don't know how they did it, but every day the food was absolutely incredible. 3 courses of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was amazing. I've never eaten so well in my life. But anyway, so the expedition was to follow this ship to Antarctica. And on the way, we did lots of things. So the scientists on board, there were 30 scientists on board. They did things like drop robots into the ocean to measure sea temperatures and salinity and depth. They counted birds from all distances. There were ornithologists on the expedition. There were oceanographers, paleoclimatologists who were, whenever there was ice, they would look at the ice and understand how long it had been there. And when we got to the continent itself, they were looking to drill into the ground to look for ice deep down. All sorts of people. The idea was to compare this data with data from the previous century, because this is a part of the world that's quite untouched by human activity. And so it's a good barometer for how climate change is affecting the rest of the world. And the interesting thing is that Douglas Mawson, when he did the same experiments 100 and so many years ago now, his experiments were so good and so accurate that they provided a very, very good baseline of data from which you can compare these sorts of models now, which are much more advanced, of course. And the other thing that they were doing in this expedition was checking that satellite measurements of things like surface temperature and all of that were actually accurate, because you can measure the temperature of the surface of an ocean from a satellite, but until you literally put a thermometer in the ocean as well, you can't confirm that that's actually correct. Yeah, so you can calibrate the satellites like that. It's a lot of work. They published multiple papers in the years afterwards, and they still are doing. and then I said on the actual continent itself, we went to Mawson's base, which is still standing 100 years later, and counted the colonies of penguins all around, which I can come back to later.
Okay.
There's more. I can keep going.
Yeah, I know. Would you go again?
Yes.
In case they asked you again?
I would love to go again.
Because you said you were sick. It was horrible.
I mean, every description I can give you of this expedition was uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. It was unpleasant. It was not the kind of thing that it's not a situation I'd want to be in. But if someone says to you that you're going to have this experience which no one else gets to have and see a part of the world, your own world that you've lived on all your life, as opposed to one you haven't lived on, what am I talking about? This world that you've lived on, this place you've lived all your life and you're familiar with, but this environment is so different and so strange, and you can see it with your own eyes. I mean, of course, it will be odd to say no. I'm not an adventurer, but I do like to just see what the world is capable of, and it was just such an extreme and bizarre environment. And we went, and I enjoyed it in an intellectual sense. I mean, physically it was quite difficult, but I'd definitely go again, and this time spend more time on the continent. We spent most of our time on the ship and going around the coasts, but I'd like to spend more time on the continent. It's very hard to do though. You can't just go and wander around because it's incredibly dangerous. So you need a lot of backup, and you need permissions and all these sorts of things. So, and it's a site of scientific interest. So you can't just wander on there by yourself. You need permission, and you need to, unless you want to annoy everybody, you should be there with scientists as well. And it's very expensive.
Let's go back to the water.
Mm-hmm.
There used to be many theories about it, but nowadays we know how it comes to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So how?
So if you look at the Earth, it's 70% covered in water, and all the physical processes on the surface of the Earth are affected by that water. So the shapes of the continents, climate is essentially, climate and weather are basically just water moving through the atmosphere in different ways, propelled by the sun's heat. And so it's incredibly important for the physical geography of the Earth as well. And where that water comes from is one of these questions that is debated, but here's the best idea so far. So if you think about what water is, it's hydrogen and oxygen, H2O, and you need to go right back to the beginning of the universe to find where the hydrogen comes from. So about 3 minutes after the Big Bang, all of the hydrogen in the universe is created just in a snap. So all of that hydrogen was created then. And you have to go much further on in the universe to find out where the oxygen comes from. So the first generation of stars are formed several hundred million years after the Big Bang. They form, they shine, and then when they run out of fuel, they explode, and you get things like this. You get supernovae, and the supernovae explode into these nebulae. And a nebula is basically just the remnants of a star that has exploded. And this is not real colours, this is false colours, of course. Different colours represent different elements. And in the centre of those stars, different elements are made, so oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, etc. And so this cloud contains lots of hydrogen, lots of oxygen. This is called the Helix Nebula, and it's 700 light years away. There's another one, that's the Rosette Nebula. That's 5,000 light years away. It's 50 light years across. It's enormous. It's basically a cloud of dust and gas. And this is the most famous one, probably. This is Eagle Nebula, and it's 4 light years across. It's dust and gas. Now, this is the remnants of a star. But within this, there's plenty of hydrogen to create more stars. And so another generation of stars will form in here. And it's a place like this that our solar system came from. So our solar system is a second generation, our sun is a second generation star. And it started to form in a place like this. And there's lots of dust around this new sun. And this dust starts to form planets. And our Earth is one of those planets that forms from this dust. Cut a long story short, there is probably water in that cloud as well. But as the Earth forms, gravity sort of brings it together, and the surface is very, very hot. So a lot of the water on the surface is driven away. So for 500 million years after the Earth is formed, you get this surface on the on this planet, which is completely volcanic and dry, and there's no water here at all. But the planet is certainly here. So what happens? Where do the oceans we see come from? Well, so the best theory is that they actually come from asteroids and comets. Asteroids and comets, which are leftovers of the dust and gas clouds that didn't quite form planets. They were shifted to the edge of the solar system, beyond the orbits of Pluto. And these things are sitting there, and at some point, when our planet is very young, something disturbed that cloud very far away, maybe some massive rock or whatever else, and loads and loads of those asteroids and comets came hurtling towards the sun, and on their way, a lot of them smashed into the Earth. For 500 million years, this is what happened. We were bombarded by asteroids and comets. It's a period called the Late Heavy Bombardment, and each one of those asteroids and comets brought a little bit of water, and so the oceans were formed from this delivery. And so all of the oceans are much younger than the Earth itself, and they're all actually from the edge of the solar system. That's where most of the water comes from.
Okay, and where there is water, there is life.
Well,
so
at least on this planet, yeah. We don't know about anywhere else.
yeah, on your expedition to Antarctica, the scientists were looking for living things in the ocean at all possible scales. So, but which animals did you see?
I saw, so I mean, I'm one of the most unobservant people in the world, so I'll see lots of things around me and I won't notice anything. But on the way there, we did see a lot of Southern Ocean birds, which I don't have pictures of actually, but they're some of the most beautiful things. So things like storm petrels that would sort of fly around, birds that I can't remember the name of now, that would essentially be on the wing for weeks at a time, waiting for seals and whatever, and penguins or whatever else down there to be fishing. But the most impressive creatures, I suppose, I would see. I'll go further along in this presentation, because there's not. I mean, when you go further south, what you see is lots of ice, of course, and not much else. And it's like, what on earth could survive down here? And what does survive are these things. And we saw these. These are pictures we took ourselves. There are just billions of them. Oh, not billions, obviously. Many, many thousands. Absolutely beautiful. Obviously, I had to take a selfie with one. So these are Adelie penguins. Absolutely amazing creatures. Birds, obviously. And they this is their natural habitat. They live there. There are other species of penguins that live on the subantarctic islands as you get on the way. We didn't really see those ones. And there are other species like emperor penguins and so on that live a bit further in. But on the edges, you see lots of these things because they fish on the edges of the ice. They eat krill and other things.
Were you afraid of you?
No, not at all. They weren't afraid at all. So they're very clever. They'll let you get close.
How close?
I mean, we tried to get as close as possible, but you're not really supposed to. You're supposed to leave the animals alone. And so we were warned to stay away. And so we did. But, you could sit there and they would come right up to you. And if you tried to do anything to sort of touch them, they would move faster than you across the ice. I mean, they knew how to move across the ice better than you. And you can't move fast across the ice because, the ice is only about 2 meters thick here. So you need to be careful. And there's like 5 kilometers of ocean underneath, whereas they can swim in minus whatever it was. The other creature we saw a lot of were these. These are seals, and they were absolutely beautiful. So in the mornings, these creatures would come up out of the ocean to sleep, and they sort of hunt at night, and they eat krill as well. Really cute. They're just basically tubes of fat, I think. Which is why they can swim underwater in the cold. There's another penguin, in case you were wondering. But yeah, we were told that you can tell how successful an Antarctic expedition is by the number of penguin pictures that come back. There's about 30 of us on this expedition. I think we must have taken 2 or 3 million pictures of these things. Yeah.
And you only show us 5.
Do you want more? I've got so many. I honestly,
No, I'm just joking.
Yeah. I've got video as well. Penguins. No, all the time.
No, now we were talking about, we didn't talk a lot about the eyes. You said in one of your lecture before that you actually realized on Antarctica that you can see a lot of shades of white.
Yeah, that's right. You can see a lot of shades of white. If you look back to these pictures here, in some senses you might think it's a photographic trick, but it's not. There really is nothing but white in these places and a bit of blue. You know, I mean, it's very, very hard to describe. It's a very white continent because it's just all water. Everything you see there is water of different forms, apart from the sky. There's clouds, there's ice cap there, ice on the surface, and then ocean. It's just all water. Your entire environment is water mixing between different modes at different times, depending on the sunlight and humidity and so on, pressure, air pressure. And so when you just see this for days and days and days and days, and in fact, weeks, you begin to see differences in all the colors of white. You see differences in all the blues. When we saw icebergs, for example, if you looked very carefully at the bottom, you could see that where it met the water, it would be where it met the surface of the ocean, rather, it would be like an electric blue. I think you can see it in one of these pictures. Yeah, I don't know if you can see it in this light, but where it meets the line of the water, it's like a blue because number one, when you see any vague hints of color, your eyes get really sensitive to it, and you think, "Wow, that's amazing blue." It doesn't look so amazing here, given all its colors. But what is actually happening is that the light goes into the ice at the top, bounces around inside, then goes underwater and comes out again. And so there is some interesting refraction and light interaction going on, which we don't normally see, and it's just amazing. It's very ethereal. What happens is that you see this colors all day, and then suddenly at here we go. The only colors that are different are sunset. So when we got to Antarctica, it was December, middle of December, and so that was Antarctic summer, so the sun doesn't go down at all. It's always light. And the most color you ever get all day long is this time at night. About 2 a.m, the sun comes right down low in the sky, and it stays there for about an hour and then comes up again. And so you get this golden color, and you also get sunsets which are purple and amber, and there's deep blues in there as well. It's like there's no color all the rest of the day apart from these 2 hours when all of the color of the whole world is compressed into that moment, and then it goes white again. So of course your eyes have to readjust to all these things, and you see incredible differences in just all the whites of the different types of ice, the different types of water. It's either real or you're just slightly going mad because you can't see anything else. I'm never quite sure which one it is.
I forgot to ask you before.
Yeah.
How cold were you there?
Oh, really cold, really cold. I mean, it is. These pictures are taken on quite calm days, and on days when there's no wind, it would be -20 outside, but you didn't really feel it. You could stand outside and wear a t-shirt, and it was fine. As soon as the wind was like more than 2 miles an hour, it was like it was cutting you through all the clothes all the time. So
even though you had really good clothes. I mean, they were
even if you had really good clothes, after you could spend maybe a bit more time outside, but eventually you'd feel the cold. And dressing to go outside in like when it was windy or blizzardy was a real exercise, because you had probably 3 or 4 layers of clothing. You had to put them on in a very specific way so that there was no way the air could get in at any of the junctions, because as soon as it did, you would feel it instantly, like a knife going through. It was so cold. But if you did it properly, covered everything up, you could probably spend an hour or 2 outside. The coldest I ever got was when we got to the continent, and we had to travel to we had to travel to the base, the Antarctic base, Douglas Mawson's Antarctic base, which was still in existence, this wooden hut. But because a huge iceberg had collided with the continent, it meant that we couldn't sail into the harbour in front of the base. So we had to sort of put the ship at the edge of this big iceberg, which was about, I don't know, 100 kilometers, or maybe a bit less, from the base itself, and then drive across the surface of the ice. And even driving at 30 miles an hour, which is the maximum speed you can go on very thin ice, sort of weaving between the holes in the ice and things, incredibly dangerous. Even then, it felt like, it was like even though I had 4 or 5 layers plus a snowsuit on and various other things, I remember holding on to this this sort of like, it was like I suppose it was like a big scooter essentially, for about 5 hours, and shivering inside for 5 hours as we went along, and the ground was quite hard, so you were shaking as you went along this ground as well. That was the most cold and most unpleasant, because there was no respite. You can't stop. If you stop, then the car won't start again, so you have to keep going continuously for 5 hours. That was probably, I would say, minus 40 or 50 or something, but because of the wind more than anything else. Yeah, it wasn't pleasant.
Okay. And then your trip ended epic.
So we were due to go home. We'd done all this. We were going to go home, and we were on time. And as we turned the ship around to go home, you could see there was a bad weather system in the distance. And we were used to this by now, because on this ship, on this continent, you were told that the weather is everything. It controls everything. It controls your timetables. It controls everything. The ship's captains down there don't have an itinerary. What they say they have is a book of intentions mediated by the weather. And so you might be able to go from here 1 kilometer that way in 10 minutes in a normal day. But if the weather is against you, it might take you 2 days to get to the same distance. So they just don't know. And they could see the weather in the distance was a little bit bad. The clouds were quite heavy. And so they wanted to get out of the system before, the winds picked up. And we'd had some good weather before. So we started to go, but then the wind picked up. And what happens when the wind picks up is that all the ice that's floating around the continent, which is this enormous field of ice, which I showed you pictures of, like this, it gets blown around by the winds. And so the wind started to blow towards the continent, and all this ice moved towards the continent. When it does that, it piles on itself and becomes one big sheet of ice. It's like all stuck together, and we were stuck in the middle of it. And there's no way we could go out. And this happens to ships quite often. They're strengthened against this. And some ships are able to even break out. But our ship wasn't big enough. So we just had to wait. And people can wait up to several weeks just to wait to get out, because the wind will blow the other way and all this ice will just crack open and you can just go. But for us, we were stuck there for 10 days. 7 to 10 days. And then the ship's captain issued a mayday around Christmas Day or something to say, look, we need to be rescued. And so then various other ships came to our rescue, which was another story altogether, which I didn't put in the book, but essentially became world news at that point. And it was on all the news channels, partly because I think there was no other news. Between Christmas and New Year, nothing happens. And so this was something that was going on. And so there was this whole thing about, will they rescue us, will they won't, will they not? And in the end, we were rescued by a Chinese helicopter that took us from our ship to an Australian ship. And and then we spent 3 more weeks sort of on going back.
Okay, so can you tell me more about the results, about the things the scientists already published? They measured a lot of things.
Yeah,
the temperature, the quality of the water.
Everything. They measured lots and lots of things, and I think that a lot of the analysis is still going on. So 6 or 7 years later, the analysis is still happening. So from my memory, some of the things they found. So one of the studies they were doing was with an ornithologist who went to the base, Douglas Mawson's base, where I went on that ride, which I described to you. And she was there counting the number of penguins, because there's a very famous penguin colony there in near Douglas Mawson's base. And he'd counted it when he'd arrived there 100 years ago, and there were tens of thousands of these things. And we went there in 2013, and the numbers had just dropped. There was less than half of them were left. Partly that was due to changes in the climate, but mainly because, as I said to you, this massive iceberg had collided with the continent, which meant that the edge of the ocean was now another 100 kilometers away. So these penguins are having to walk that far back because they have to they fish, or they get their krill rather, from the edge of the ice. So the entire generations of these penguins had gone, and they were on the floor. There were penguin eggs that clearly had been the chicks had come out, but the parent penguins had decided that they weren't going to do anything about them and let them die. So there's dead chicks everywhere. It was quite unpleasant. But that's what they do. They realize that they can't do it this year, so they're going to try again next year. And that's what they do. And the ornithologist I was with explained that penguins just won't look after chicks. They have no chance of keeping survival. So some of them survived. The numbers had gone down hugely. So that's one thing that was published in research. Another thing they found was they were looking at the wind in the Southern Ocean and how it affects the ice cover of that part of the world, and therefore what it's doing to the sort of wind currents and ocean currents. And various predictions had shown that the equivalent of what we call the jet stream up in the north was moving up, I think, moving north, which means that the ice patterns and wind patterns would change around the Antarctic. The Antarctic's a very important part of the world to maintain global weather, global ice and sea currents and so on. And so if this jet stream essentially moves, then it's bad news. And they found that it started to move, basically. And of course, this is going to take many, many more years of experiments and measurements, but they saw that it was moving. There are many, many other papers based on the flora and fauna of the various islands on the way to Antarctica, which have changed completely because of the warming temperatures. There's a thing called the tree line, which is the furthest south that trees can exist. And it's on one of these Antarctic islands. And it's like the last tree south. There's no trees below then, because you just can't survive. And they'd found that tree line was moving north, I think, because it was just getting warmer and warmer. Or no, it was getting south. It was moving south, sorry, because the temperatures are getting warmer and warmer down south. And the Antarctic is actually, there are all sorts of parts of it which are melting faster, and it's a barometer for the rest of the planet. Anyway, lots of stuff.
Did they measure the quantity of the ice?
No,
What's happening with the ice?
So they can't measure the quantity of the ice because being a point source in the ocean, you can't do that. You do that with the satellites. The Antarctic, bizarrely, is it's getting colder in many parts, whereas the Arctic is warming rapidly. The overall temperature of the Earth is getting higher, but the Antarctic is going the other way. But the West Antarctic, for example, is melting quickly. Entire ice sheets on different parts of the continent are moving. It's a very complicated picture. They themselves couldn't measure the quantity of the ice, but what they did do was when they got to the Mawson's huts, they did some drilling, and they drilled very deep and took out ice cores to look at the bubbles trapped deep down, so they could look at old climates and things. So that analysis is still ongoing.
Okay. What about the pollution? Did they measure that? The pollution of water, pollution of air?
So they did measure some pollution. One of the people on the ship was an oceanographer who was taking samples of the ocean, Southern Ocean, all the way to the Antarctic, and did some quick analysis on the ship. I mean, obviously, a lot of the analysis has to be done back in labs on mainland, but they had some spectrometers and things on the ship itself. And he found plastics. This was 2013, before everyone realized there were plastics everywhere. I mean, obviously scientists knew that before, but before it became a big global thing. But he was showing us microplastics in the Southern Ocean, which is, like I said, one of the most untouched parts of the world. I mean, humans hardly ever go there. But it shows you that all the ocean currents, all the winds, they're all connected. And the Antarctic is an important driver of all those currents. So eventually, even if you drop something into the ocean in the Atlantic, it will make its way to the Southern Ocean eventually, which is very, very far away. So it's a real global problem. So there's a lot of pollution, yes.
Okay. We started with the water. Should we end with the water? So after your book, how do you look at water now? What do you think about it? You were obsessed with it after you wrote a book? What do you say now? You're still obsessed with it?
I mean, it's hard to be obsessed with something for a very long time. As I said, my attention span is very small. But water is full of very interesting things, and it's worth being obsessed about, I think. And the intention of this, of when I wanted to start writing about it, was to give people a sense of a different feeling about water. I mean, water is probably the most familiar thing to you. It's the most familiar thing. I mean, if you go back to, it's something that every human in the world, you can connect with them about water. You know what water is, they know what water is, you know what you do with it, you know what they do with it. If you go back to the very first human beings, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago, what they're doing with water is probably what you're doing with water. You know, it's just the same. There's nothing different. You know, their culture will be very different. What their food they're eating will be very different. Their language will probably be very different. But the fact is that they will use water in the same way as you're using water today. And it's the same water, actually. You know, if there's life elsewhere, somewhere else, it's probably likely they're doing the same things with water that we do. And that's, you know, it floods all our cells and makes energy move around, and it allows DNA and proteins and so on to work. You know, they might have other things that transfer information between generations. You know, we use DNA, they might use something else. We use proteins to build our bodies, they might use something else. But I bet you they use water to make all of that work, because water is this thing that can do a bunch of unique things in your body chemically. And so when you realize that water does all these weird things, and that without its weird behavior, none of us would be here, I just wanted people to realize that, and then go back to their glass of water and think, this is not boring at all. This is probably the most strange thing in the universe. It's something that scientists often struggle to understand even today, and get fearful to actually study because it's so weird. And it's like waking up. It's like being a fish and waking up you're in an ocean. You know, you just didn't realize it until that point. That this familiar thing is so strange. And I think that's all I wanted, was for people to look at it in a slightly different way. Someone said to me when I was researching this book that human beings think that they're the sort of most intelligent and controlling of the life forms that we know of and stuff. And of course it's true. We've really molded this world into exactly the way we want it, and, you know, for good or bad, whatever you want to say. But there's another way to look at it, which is that water has invented us to carry itself around in interesting places to do interesting things. And essentially that's true. We exist only because water is as strange as it is, and we just carry it around from place to place. When we're gone, it will still be here doing exactly what it's doing, and going into another body to be carried around. So you can look at it in quite different ways. Water, I think, is the controlling thing, and I find that quite interesting.